All right, here we go. Maybe. See if it works this time. All right, so today, the outcomes for this session are to develop and refine the rationale for creating performance. We all have, but we're just going to remind ourselves of that. And then to create performance tasks to access and to assess student learning. So that's our takeaway, of what we want to happen at the end. Just to remind ourselves, especially for those of you who may be new for this session, we're going to begin and end on time. So this is a 1-hour session, so we will end at 4. We ask that you please stay focused. As always, you guys know us. We always want to have more and give you as much. So that we ask that you do stay with us. Be respectful of everybody's opinions. That's both the oral and the written. Assume positive intent. We're all in the same boat. None of us have done this before in terms of having all complete online because of school closure. So we're all here because we're awesome and we want to continue to grow as educators. Use the chat feature for questions and responses. I'll go over that in just a second in more detail. And then if you would please mute your microphone when not speaking, just so we don't have the background noise of everybody. And that includes me and my dogs, so hopefully they'll stay quiet. So just a little housekeeping about the chat. Please share questions and ideas in the chat. Feel free to use it as a back channel the whole time. We highly recommend that and love it. Questions will be tracked and responded to, so we will try to do that at logical pausing points. We'll have a Q&A session near the end, and then in follow-up communication for any of them that we may not have gotten to. And just to let you know, for full disclosure, we are taping this so that we can share this with anybody who registered but was unable to make it. And we also save the chat because that allows us to follow up on any unanswered questions, as well as to compile the additional resources and ideas that you share across, so that we're not always reinventing the wheel independently. All right, so our welcome and warm up. So what has changed about the way you plan and assign student learning activities in the recent weeks since the school closure? And what has stayed the same? Go ahead and take a few minutes to think about that. And first, use the chat and answer that. How has it changed about the way you plan? And then what has stayed the same? Okay, we'll give everybody a couple more minutes to add something to the chat. Okay, and Randy, what are you seeing in the chat bar? What are some of those great ideas that people are sharing?
We are seeing that some of our folks are using lots of check-in questions. So we've talked about journaling and such in the past, and I see some folks talking about that. I see Deborah talking about downloading more material, and I was going to call on her in chat to say a little bit more about what that meant to her in this particular context. Because I know that we are all reaching out to find more resources, right, to help us help supplement and guide some of our instruction at this time. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about Deborah, your thinking on that, Deborah, if you would like to unmute yourself or just leave a few short message for us in the box.
Okay, well, while
Deborah, I see you talking, so I will unmute you.
Okay. I was trying to unmute myself. But it's more materials are free, and so I'm using those free materials more now because we're getting more, we're getting a lot more than just a trial. You can do it for a longer period of time. And so I think I have a better resource than just paper and pencil things.
Okay. So it's that process of finding all these new resources, knowing that we're getting a bunch of free stuff thrown at us in many cases, and then figuring out what is separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, to make sense for our kids.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. We're seeing some other conversation. Some things are the same, right? We're planning to respond to the SEL needs of our kids and planning, to meet them where they are. What's changed though is some of that delivery method. Some other conversation is talking more about how, on the whole, we as educators are getting our feet under us, but we are still struggling to find all of our kids or bring more of our kids into the fold.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about performance tasks, because lots of us have done performance tasks in the past, but of course they look a little different now, just the way in which we give it to kids and what the expectations are. And the other thing is that for those of us who really have not done a lot of performance tasks, because they do take quite a bit of time in order to really think about it and try to get everything set up ahead of time if they're a longer project, this is our opportunity. So it really does give us a time to really stop and think about that. In general, if we think about the different types of the way we can assess kids and give them opportunities to practice, one thing that jumps out is that the performance assessment is not always a great match if it's just around the concepts alone. And there's easier ways to do that basic understanding. But it is a good match and great for when we have skills and reasoning, and typically help students bring multiple skills and learning targets together. And obviously, if we want them to create any kind of product or model, things like that, then that's where our performance tasks really come into play. So thinking about that, what might performance tasks lend themselves more readily to distance learning? Why might they be maybe a little bit easier now than they may have been in our in-class time with the kids earlier this year? And once again, go ahead and add your thoughts. Okay, and Randy, what are we seeing?
We're seeing a lot of recognition that students, especially in this context, have more opportunities for self-paced work and self-paced discovery. And we'll speak to this later, a little bit later in the session, I know, but self-paced doesn't always mean at your own pace. There can be some guidelines and deadlines thrown in throughout, but we're definitely seeing a lot of conversation around that.
Okay, great, yeah. One of the things that I know I think almost everybody on this, in this session especially, we're basically trying to maintain the knowledge and skills that we've taught throughout the year. And so this is another really good way to do that that's different than what we have maybe done in the past. And typically it's considered engaging for the kids because oftentimes we want to try to make it as relevant as possible. And as I believe somebody had mentioned earlier about the planning, that student choice aspect is typically in a performance task in some way. So let's dig in and really look at what does it mean to create a performance task. So there's really 8 steps that we're going to walk through. And while we walk through that, after each one, I'm going to give quite a few examples. And so as you're listening to those examples, think about if any of them are seeds for another, for an idea you have, or if you're interested in learning more about any of them that are mentioned, just let Randy or I know. As well, again, if you've got something that sparks in your brain and you're like, oh my gosh, I remember I did this, or I'm doing this, please add it to the chat so that we can share with each other. So the first step is to determine the purpose of the task or the project. Why are we doing it? What do we want the kids to get out of it? And then the second one, of course, directly connected to that is to specify the ICANs or the learning targets. In other words, making sure that it's aligned. That's oftentimes the struggle that we've had for those of us who have been in the field for a while. We used to have these really grand projects sometimes, but then we really, the time benefit is just not there because it just didn't do enough. And so really getting those multiple ICANs, multiple learning targets is really helpful. Third, specify performance expectations and indicators of success. So what does it look like when it's done right so that we can share that with kids and that we have a better understanding as we're designing the rest of it. And those expectations are going to be really critical. The worst thing that ever happens to us, I think, as teachers is when we have a great idea in our minds, we say it, we say what we want, and we get what we want, but what we said isn't really what our vision was. Fourth, create an authentic and meaningful context for the task. So why? Why should kids care about this? How does it connect to the real world? Fourth, determine the structure of the task. And this we're going to dive into quite a bit in terms of how much is teacher-led versus how much is student-led. And that's really, really important even in our remote learning environment now. Fifth, develop a scoring guide / feedback mechanism. I recognize that the vast majority of us, again on the call, are not doing grades or we're doing a pass, fail, or pass incomplete, but that feedback mechanism is still really critical for the kids at this time. Next, generate or select exemplar responses to use as models. We can have non-models as well or non-exemplars, but we definitely want to see as much as possible show the kids so that they have a visual, oral, or our written directions of what's expected. And then lastly, revising the task as necessary. For us, as we're going through it, just making sure it's like, does that make sense? And then at the end, reflecting so that we can really make it even better the next time we do this. So determine the purpose of the task or project. Is this for practice of skills? Is it enrichment? Is it a culmination and integration of multiple learning targets, which most performance tasks, especially the larger ones, are? And then are students led on a path, or are they discovering for themselves? Those are some of the questions we want to ask ourselves. And so some examples, if we're leading kids down a path, which isn't a bad thing, it means we're giving them a lot of structure and a lot of detailed descriptors of what we want. That could be things like in a biology classroom where we're asking kids to create a three-dimensional model of the cell. For any number of subject areas, it may be where we're giving kids a case study. It's some example from the real world that we're asking them to read, to think about, and to respond to in some way. Not so much as hands-on as some of the other ones, but definitely still that idea of a performance task and that relevancy to the real world. On the flip side, if we're asking kids to do more discovery on their own and being more open to that, that's when we get into the research aspects, where it could be we give them a broad topic and they a more narrow one to go down. The image in the left-hand corner is a painting by Pablo Picasso called Guernica, and it's about a famous battle that occurred in Spain. And so one of the performance tasks that I've seen done in a class is they started with this and the kids responded to it and then had to go and do some research around that battle. There were a couple of parameters to it, but they really got to decide what they wanted to research in terms of that time period. And then lastly, you'll see there's a drawing of it's like a grid of a town. So in math classes, I've seen like the geometry town where the kids have a couple of parameters in terms of they have to have a certain number of buildings or roads, but after that, then they're free to create and discover on their own what they want in terms of the types of buildings, in terms of geometric shapes, and which are parallel, which ones are perpendicular, and so forth. So the second one then is to specify the ICANNs addressed or practiced. What skills or concepts, what application of knowledge will students be using and expected to have? And so for this, a couple of examples, again, in mathematics, if we're doing probability, which if this is one of our focus standards for this time, what a great time, because we oftentimes don't get to it. For our older kids, it could be casino games and creating a game of chance. For our younger kids, it's magic and creating a game of chance. Either way is that idea of, instead of doing probability problems, which they probably did as a precursor, now let's see, can they create their own? Can they create their own game that uses probability and those skills? The other picture then represents the Hudsucker Proxy, which is a movie about a man who invents the hula hoop. Sorry, I actually had to do the hula hoop in order to remember the name. The hula hoop. And so in economics, it could be asking the kids to do some real life research into supply and demand examples, especially really when those get off kilter. In some states, if the economics or social studies standards also include more business, or if it's a business class, they may actually create a prototype and a business plan and talk supply and demand and other economic ICANNs that way. Third then is to specify the performance expectations and indicators of success. So we use this so that we can create the guidelines, the directions, and the rubric for the kids. The more that we pre-think this, the better the results are from the kids, because they will do what we ask. They definitely can't do what we just have stuck in our brains. And it also helps determine what students will receive feedback on. So definitely trying to keep that in mind. What do you want the students to get out of it? What is it really that you want them to be able to practice, to hone their skills on, and to produce? And so some examples that go with this idea is thinking about the Rube Goldberg machine. If we are in a science class, especially physics or physical science, the kids create their own Rube Goldberg, but there has to be some kind of expectations and indicators of success. It's not just throwing some things together, but it actually has to work. There has to be a certain number of steps. They have to use certain kinds of simple tools. So, so those are the things that we're talking about in terms of expectations and indicators of success. Does it work? How often does it work? Does it have to work more than once? Another idea is to create a Twitter feed and hashtags for an historical during an influential moment. For our middle school U.S. history, imagine if George Washington and the rest of the revolutionary heroes had Twitter. And what would George Washington's Twitter feed look like? Who would be responding to him? What would they say as they're getting ready for the Battle of Saratoga, say? So it's another way of doing that, but then saying, okay, so what is it that you expect? What should this look like? It can't be like, hey, sup, you know, it's what do you really want to see from the kids as they're creating this Twitter feed and really thinking about the dynamics between different historical figures and what else was going on in the country. And then the last one, the picture, is of a newspaper. And in English classes, we've oftentimes seen teachers, instead of the kids writing a background paper, so for instance, if they're reading Animal Farm, they could do a background paper on the evolution, because Animal Farm is an allegory of that. Or instead, some teachers that we've seen have the kids create a front page of a newspaper where they have to do several different articles that discuss what's going on socially, economically, and that type of things, and politically, so that they can really get an understanding and a feel for what's behind the writing of Animal Farm and that story. So consider the first three steps that we talked about: determining the purpose of the task or the project, specifying the ICANNs addressed or practiced, and specifying the expectations that we have of kids and the indicators of success. What does it look like when they're successful? Go ahead and in the chat, in what ways do these steps echo the practices you already use in your planning? So what feels familiar to you? What do you already do as you're thinking about creating lessons for your kids, creating assignments? And we'll give everybody a few more moments to get their thoughts down. In what ways do these steps echo what you already do when you're planning out learning activities for your kids? And Randy, what are we seeing?
We're seeing a lot of, yep, I do that. So we're seeing a lot of participants connecting with the idea of using ICANNs and using that to inform planning. And particularly with the idea of establishing rubrics to discuss performance expectations and indicators of success has resonated and come up a few different times as well. So yeah, it seems as though these are practices that resonate with many of us that are on the call.
Absolutely, and that's what we expected as well, because we know you guys. And so that's one of the things that I think is a resonating message that keeps getting lost, because we're inundated with all these things about online learning, remote learning, distance learning, and all stuff. When it comes right down to it and we're planning what we're going to ask the kids to do, good teaching is good teaching. And yes, we miss the classroom and we miss being one-on-one and we miss in person with our kids. When we're planning it out, though, these first 3 steps are exactly what you guys do anyways. And so to me, when I stop to think about that, and the same thing for Randy and I, as we're planning these out, it helped me to think of that while saying, you know what, at the end of the day, a lot of the things that we do are still the same. It's the same thought process, but how we deliver it may look just a little different. So that's awesome. Now, then, let's look at the rest of the steps, because some of these then really are different for remote learning, and some of them are the same whether we use it now or whether we use it next year when we're back in school. So the next step, the 4th step, is to create an authentic context for the task. Why should kids care about this? What is the real life application and connection for the kids? Examples of this could include scenarios, problems to solve, models to create, that type of thing. It can be local, so there could be an authentic context locally within your state, within your city, or at least region of the United States. It could be time sensitive. If there's something going on, which right now there's definitely on, it may be that we really relate directly back to that. Or it could be an historical precedence, something that not too far back in the future happened, and the question is, would it happen again? So those are some of our guiding questions. A couple of examples that we've seen. The first 2, the graph and Typhoid Mary, of course, are if we've got kids that are typically older and more mature, then we can absolutely tap into this. The kids need to talk about what's going on. And I know Liz Schilling does a lot, I'm going to call you out, Liz, does a lot of really trying to connect with the kids on a very personal level and really take care of the SEL, as well as trying to do math. And so this is maybe a way to do that, just depending on the maturity of your kids. That's a call you have to make because you know your kids best. But the idea of Typhoid Mary, that idea of viral transmission and public health versus private versus personal health is a huge debate right now that can happen in a science class or health class. The next one in the top right corner is a political cartoon by Thomas Nast back in the 1800s. I'll just put it that way. And so in social studies, it could be that we relate it to that context of using political cartoons, either analyzing those current or historical ones, or we have the kids create their own. That creating their own could be that next step after they look at a few examples, so that they really get a feel for why political cartoons and how do they help address some of the concerns that people have in a different way than just writing or talking about it. The smoothies, one thing that I saw math and a health PE teacher do is they co-planned this where the kids had to create a healthy smoothie. It couldn't be one that they typically would find at a store. And then, of course, the mathematics comes in with the recipe. So this was a middle school that did that. Again, something that definitely contextually related back to the kids. The bottom right corner, the tree that has all those lovely social media icons on it. Something that I saw in a ninth grade classroom a few years ago was the kids created a contract for responsible use of social media for their school. They felt that everything was just so getting so out of control with sexting and with bullying online that they decided that that's what they were going to do. So that was the performance task that the teacher came up with the kids in saying, let's do this and then let's present it to the rest of the school and get the word out of what it means to use it responsibly. Bottom, that's Mars. Supposedly, it will be one day. So there is an actual group of people who have been selected to live forever on Mars once they get there and to create a colony. And so having the kids really look into what would it take in order to make that happen. And what lessons can we learn from Mars that we can use here on Earth when it comes to global climate change. And then the last one, something that I saw in a classroom was to help support writing. The teacher had the kids create a narrative based on a picture, a personal picture that had them and at least one other person in it that they still talk to, like a family member. And they had to write. It was really based on, you know, could you use details? And then they had to send a letter to that person. And the person then was asked to write their own interpretation of the event. And the kids compared their point of view to someone else's when it came to a personal event. Okay, so then the heart of it is determining the structure of the task. We really need to decide, and we talked a little bit about this for you guys that were here on Tuesday, decide whether the teacher or the student identifies the problem. So thinking about it in terms of like before, during, and after. How much is teacher, how much is student decided? At the beginning, does the teacher set up the prompt and the problem, or do the students create their own? Not create their own problem, but create whatever topic that they're going to actually look into or do. In the middle, during the task, does the teacher determine what strategies and what materials the kids will use? So thinking about if they're building something or if they're trying to solve or, you know, do some kind of solution oriented task. Do the kids have more freedom in terms of determining what they're going to use? And then at the end, is it the teacher that determines, is it us that determines how they're going to show us their final product, or do the kids get to? And that's where we always have that choice aspect if we want to, in terms of, is it a PowerPoint, is it a video, is it a poster that of course nowadays that they would take a picture of. So that is completely up to us in terms of where, how much structure. And if we look at this chart, which we're going to send out in the email, we don't have to follow one specific column. We may be more teacher directed in terms of what are they supposed to do, but then we give a little bit of support, but let the kids select what kind of strategies and materials they use. And then we might let the kids select from 5 different ways that they might present. So that's definitely something to think about in terms of when we're creating these performance tasks, whether they're the short ones, which might only take 15 or 30 minutes, or whether they're the longer ones, which I think is what typically pops into our mind, those ones that'll take multiple days for the kids to do. So thinking about that then, some of those ideas of performance tasks that really hit on the structure aspect, raft, not that we're having the kids build a raft, although that might be interesting, but raft, R-A-F-T, stands for role, audience, format, and topic. And we'll send out the one-pager on that as well. Works in a lot of different subject areas. I think I've seen it in just about all of them. where again, the teacher sometimes assigns the role, like for instance, the student may play the part of a parent, or they may play a part of a scientist, or a local community member, or a store owner, just depending on what the topic is. The audience, they have to write something, and so who is the audience? Is it fellow peers? Is it little kids? Is it the community? Format, that's what it looks like. Is it an opinion paper? Is it an article? Is it a brochure or a flyer? What is it that they're actually creating? And then topic, that's what is it about? And so we've seen that in a lot of different places. Oftentimes, if there's some kind of community or social issue, RAFT works really well because the topic is that issue, and then the format can be all sorts of different things. Like I said, like a newspaper article or brochure, things like that. It also helps with point of view quite a bit as well. Our big picture on the right-hand side, actually a photo essay. And so one of the things is if we're going to ask the kids to do some out-of-the-box thinking and out-of-the-box way to respond to us, a photo essay might be a good way. This one shows just the pictures that the kids found in order to create a cohesive line of thought from the beginning to the end. Some of them also then say, okay, you have to have X number of pictures, but you also have to have of words. One of them that I saw was a photo essay of solving a Rubik's Cube. And so for each one of the steps that the kid took, he had a picture and then he had a small blurb about that. So as an informational essay type of thing. I believe that was actually in a science class because they were really focused in on, are the kids thinking about the scientific way of thinking of problem solving. And then lastly, our picture on this slide, The Man in the High Castle is an alternate history show. It was based on a book. And so in our history classes, alternate history is a really interesting way to get kids to explore what really happened, why we sometimes don't know what really happened because it's based on who wrote it. And just that idea of either analyzing an alternate history short story or something like that, or video clip, or they could create their own based on a particular time period or fact. Okay. With developing a scoring guide then, obviously we need that when we are taking grades, and it's connected with that success criteria. Remember our expectations. What does it look like? What do we want from the kids? And it assesses that level of proficiency, but it also helps facilitate the feedback. And so once again, like I said, we may not be taking actual grades for a lot of us on the call, but we're definitely wanting to get feedback. And so that scoring guide can be a way to give the kids our expectations as well as a way to give them feedback in an easy way. The easier for us, the better. So once again, consider the middle three steps that we talked about: creating an authentic context, determining the structure, and then developing a scoring guide. How might incorporating these practices impact student engagement with the task? So if you were going to create one and give it to the kids, whether that's through Google Classroom or whether that's through a packet and an email to the kids that they can access on their phone, what does it look like? How might incorporating these practices impact student engagement with the task? And again, take a few moments to think and then jot some ideas down in the chat bar. And we know getting the kids involved at this point is still a struggle, especially depending on which state we live in. So the more we can try to impact in a positive manner student engagement, the better. So that's why we asked this question is how can incorporating some of these help? How do you think it might help get the kids more involved?
Liz, I don't know if you sent that message only to me, but it is an important point, is that giving a scoring guide ahead of time allows students to really know exactly what we're looking for, and it allows us to discuss that. So even when we think we're being clear, what we typed, what we communicated has been as clear as we might want. So allowing students to converse with us about those expectations is definitely a great opportunity to make sure we get what we're asking for.
You must read minds, Randall, because that's what I wrote in the chat.
He is a mind reader. Be careful.
We're also seeing some conversation about how feedback is always important. It helps students move people forward, and that how the scoring guides can help facilitate that as well. A lot of conversation around creating that authentic context and making sure that the task is relevant to kids, which is important even when we're in brick and mortar settings, but perhaps even more so in this remote setting is something to be mindful of.
Absolutely. And Randy, one of the things that I heard you mention that I believe from Liz was that idea of making sure it's not just handing the kids, or in this case, posting it or emailing it to them in terms of the rubric or the expectation, but it's also what are the spaces that we have now that we can either ask clarifying questions or have that conversation with kids. And that's a question I just have to the group. Like, what are the different ways that we make sure that the kids understand what our expectations are?
Vanessa, would you like them to type responses to that, or would you like them to meet themselves?
Either way is fine. If anybody wants to say it out loud, that's fine too.
Well, we're seeing Liz Voltis mentioning that she encourages students to comment on the rubric in Google Classroom, so they can say exactly, this is as clear as mud, or no, I understand this portion of the rubric. So that's one opportunity. We're also seeing Google Meet used specifically to discuss the rubric, as well as providing examples and non-examples, as we talked about earlier.
Okay, great. Thank you guys for sharing. Okay, so let's look at the last two then. And this goes directly to what you were just saying, generating and selecting model responses. Showing students what that quality work looks like is super helpful. It also can be really helpful to us if it's the first time we're putting together this project or this task. I've known a few teachers who have created whatever that project is. They've actually created one themselves just so they could make sure that they were really crystal clear on what the expectations were and what they would want to give feedback on. It also then, of course, gave a good model for the kids. Non-examples can also be helpful when directly related to the scoring guide or expectations. So you want to make sure that you are not just showing a non-example, but really talking about it either because you've annotated it and shared it, you've posted it for that asynchronous piece, or because like you guys had mentioned, you have a Google Meet and you talk about it then. So either way, just making sure that it's really clear why is this a non-example.
One idea to add to that, especially thinking about examples and non-examples and how they might be used. I was talking with the teacher a few weeks ago before the great pause happened about designing his own performance task. And one thing he mentioned about the power of generating some of his own examples and not just looking at student work is he could put himself in the mindset of that student who always wants to do the bare minimum or tries to interpret the rubric in the most literal way possible. So they could kind of test and see where language might not have been as clear as he had hoped. So sometimes when we approach that rubric from a real kind of cynical lens, so to speak, it helps us to make sure our own language of communication to kids is even tighter.
Okay, great. Thanks, Randy. So a couple of examples then of some other performance tasks that help highlight that really the importance of models and where we might find them. Along with making our own, sometimes we can find them. So for instance, in the top left-hand corner, the more you know, those are public service announcement ads. You guys probably all remember those from growing up, but they seem like there were a lot more back then. But you can find examples of those. And so showing that to the kids as examples may help to spark in them. It's like, okay, that's what mine should sound like. And then that could be a performance task in any of the subject areas, really, of creating a PSA where they videotape themselves on their phone or something else and then send it to you. Another one in the top right corner, if you're having the kids create a theme park, which I've seen in both math and science classrooms and some engineering classes. Creating a theme park takes a lot of thinking, a lot of critical thinking, and a lot of math skills. And so if you're expecting them to draw a map of it, having examples either from the real world, like this one, even though it doesn't look real world, is another good way to do that. In the bottom right corner is a picture by William Carson called The Fall of Icarus. And the reason why I put that in there is in and it was actually a literacy class that had an art theme to it. So it was kind of, they got art and literacy credit for it. But the kids were really studying that idea of art, inspiring art. And so the kids had to create a poem from this picture, but the picture is actually inspired by a poem in the first place, or the story of Icarus and his wings with wax and falling into the sea. So again, showing examples that you can find and not always necessarily have to make your own. The last one in the bottom left corner then on this slide is a story that my son actually loved, and then I saw one of my good friends that's an English teacher use it for point of view. It's the three little stories, or the true story of the three little pigs by A. Wolf. And so she used that as an example, and then they had to take whatever they were reading currently and create a different version of the ending or a different version of a certain chapter from a different character's point of view. So really hitting hard that point of view aspect of the standards. And then lastly, revising the task as necessary, just like we do all the rest of the time when we're teaching, is that reflection piece both in the middle, like Randy said, trying to it in terms of your most reticent kid and making sure that the language is clear, but also at the end for next time. If you're going to put this kind of effort into it, which we really highly recommend because they can be so rewarding for both us and for the kids, then figure out immediately how you might tweak it for the next time so that you don't forget those things. Okay, so those are our 8. Determining the purpose, making sure we align to our ICANNs, and multiple ICANNs the better. Specifying the expectations and the indicators of success, what does that look like? Creating that authentic, meaningful context, which a lot of you guys had mentioned that was so critical for that engagement. Determining the structure of the task, how much are you controlling? How much does the student have a choice in? Developing that scoring guide that's important for the feedback at this point in our school year. Generating non-examples as applicable, and then revising as we go through and then at the end. So as we consider the process as a whole, what could be possible if you planned and implemented a performance task during distance learning? So if you were to create one, starting this weekend, because you got nothing better to do, can't go anywhere, and you were to give the kids a performance task next week, what's possible? What would it look like? What would you want to see from the kids? And once again, take a few moments to think and then jot down your responses in the chat. And we'll give everybody a few more moments to get some thinking down. I don't know about you guys, but for those of you that do synchronous sessions, I find wait time just, oh my goodness. It just seems so odd now, but it's still such a good habit. So Randy, what do we see some of the folks saying in the chat?
We're seeing some recognition of performance task as a great vehicle for choice, for allowing for student choice. And I think that's one thing that to be mindful of, right? Choice always helps kids engage, but certainly when we can provide those aspects in the context of performance task, we can even get further down that road. We're also seeing some ideas about some more specific examples, creating maps and using Pythagorean theorem to calculate distances between 2 points, looking at students tracking exercise routines and perhaps giving feedback, after they record their videos. We're seeing some more modeling or art drawing in cellular respiration and a variety of other content specific performance tasks as well.
Great. Those all sound like really awesome ideas, guys. And one thing that we do want to make sure that you take away with you is that idea that you don't have to create a huge 3-week project. Performance tasks come in all different shapes and sizes. So if this is something that's new, it's the first time that you're going to do this performance task, start small. Start small. And also, the one thing that I think I forgot, Randy, you forgot, unless you put it in the chat, is if you do have something that takes a little bit longer for the kids, do not hesitate to put a mini timeline, like a timeline and mini due dates. That helps you and helps the kids. Just think about yourself or think about your kid that's the biggest procrastinator. The one thing you don't want is for them to, say, oh my gosh, I forgot to do this and now we're supposed to talk about it. So if it is something that takes a little bit longer, absolutely give the kids those mini due dates. Really helps with that structure piece.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, start small so that you feel the success and the kids feel the success. All right, so we are down to our closure. First, before we do the exit ticket and the survey, are there any questions that you guys have? And at this point, you can either put them in the chat, Randy will grab them, or you can mute yourself. Any questions or additional ideas or suggestions you want to throw out to the group?
I think one thing, as you were speaking about intermediate deadlines that could be helpful, is coupling that with journaling, which we've talked about a little bit in the past few sessions. It might not always be feasible for us to always collect the Rube Goldberg machine mid-project, right? And to see evidence of that throughout. But if we ask students to journal about their progress and submit that journal and what they're writing about their experience, where they're struggling, where they're finding success, and to facilitate some feedback around that, that's another way we can still get some insight on what kids are thinking and struggling with and succeeding with without them having to lug a whole machine to school or to wherever they might be dropping things off at.
Right. Absolutely. Thanks, Randy. And that's the thing. If we're having kids do a performance task where they're actually creating something, then obviously we're not going to get the actual project itself, but we can get pictures of it or a video of it if we need to see it work. But as Randy said, definitely that self-reflection and journaling of the steps along the way can really give us some great insight in terms of the kids' understanding and they're working on it. But at the same time, the project itself is that engaging piece for the kids. Not that journaling isn't engaging, but adds to that engagement. Okay, great. Any other thoughts to share or questions? Okay. Well, we want to thank you guys again for being with us today. As soon as we get off of the webinar, please take a look at your email that you used for registering, and you will receive a feedback survey form. We really, really appreciate that you guys fill that out. It gives us some great feedback, as well as there's an opportunity to share with us additional ideas. That's helped us put the next 6 together. And that also helps us to track attendance for the certificates in June and the number of PL hours. And then lastly, we'll put this also in the email, but our exit ticket, just to think about for what upcoming ICANN statements or learning targets might you plan and implement a performance task, and what could it look like? Some of you guys already started thinking about that in the chat, and so we hope that you guys continue with that line of thought. Again, Randy and I are here, and when you get the email, please feel free to respond back if you want to set up a time with either one of us or get some additional ideas. We'll be sending out over the weekend or on Monday the recording of this, all of the ideas from the Zoom chat, and all of the ideas and some other links to ideas that were in the presentation. And Nicole, I just happened to see your chat. When are the next sessions going to be? We're going to continue doing it Tuesday and Friday. Our next one is next Tuesday. Look at mail, and you should have or will receive a flyer. But I'll make sure that any of you guys that are on this one get it. And then it's once again, click on the title and you can register from there.
Yes,
Okay.
it was sent today. So for those of you looking for a preview, I haven't yet checked it. Tuesday's topic, we're looking more at how we can really dig in and design some quality formative assessment during this time, knowing that we're not giving actual letter grades. We really want to give feedback about where students are, or get some feedback of where students are and give them some feedback to help move them forward. That's what we're really digging into on Tuesday. So again, please check your email. The schedule for the next 6 webinars is published there, so please choose whatever is most interesting to you, and we will see you then.
All right. Thank you guys, and have a great weekend.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for another great session.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.